वेलकम टू वी लर्न में आपका स्वागत है. We are discussing marketing research, session 5, sampling. Topics covered are introduction, sampling, its importance and limitations, sampling, basic concepts, steps in the sampling process, sampling designs, estimation of sample size. सैम्पलिंग जो है एक बहुत इम्पॉर्टेंट रोल प्ले करता है जब भी whenever we conduct any market research study, and there could hardly be any research which does not involve the use of sampling. In a way, it becomes the backbone of the market research. In this unit, in this session, we will be discussing a lot about the sampling concept, the limitations, the sampling and non-sampling errors. So a sampling in detail would be analyzed. When we say sampling, its importance and limitation. Sampling के बहुत ज़्यादा advantage हैं and it is very often used in market research studies. पहला advantage जो sampling का है कि the data which is collected through sampling ये एक बहुत lower cost पर होता है as compared to the data which is collected through census. Sampling जो है to a lot many times it helps in saving the time also, because it is that part of the population which is the representative of the population. So the entire population need not be surveyed and need not be researched, but only a sample who is the representative is a major source of the information. Thirdly, the accuracy of the information is also enhanced when taking a complete enumeration. Lastly, a sample is better in situation where measuring of a particular element from a group, it destroys the other elements or render them useless after the examination. When we say about some of the problems which are associated with the sampling, the first problem is that of the sampling error. And these are the kind of errors which arise due to some drawing influences and inferences about population parameters, and these are the observations which are drawn from the sample, and sample is a part of the population. Non-sampling errors, they are very difficult to completely avoid errors by simply observation or ascertainment. So the main reasons for non-sampling errors is basically the improper specification or the scope of the study, or if there is an inadequate coverage of the entire population and the sample. If there are vague definitions of the variables they are involved, and lastly when there are wrong methods of the data collections are employed, then non-sampling errors occur. There are certain basic concepts which needs to be understood while studying sampling. The first is the element. When we talk about element, it is that unit about which information is collected. This provides basically the basis for analysis according to a well-defined procedure. Second is population. Population or universe is basically the aggregate of all the elements possessing certain specified characteristics which the researcher wishes to study and defined prior to the selection of the sample. Then comes sampling units. Sampling unit is that element or elements which are considered available for selection in some stage of the sampling process. Lastly is the sampling frame. Sampling frame is the list of all the sampling units which are belonging to the population to be studied with their proper identification and which are available for selection at a stage of sampling process. Now there are steps in the sampling process. The first important step is to define the population, and while defining the population it is very important to define the elements which are used, the units which are used, the extent of the usage and the total time to be used. The second step is to specify the sample, the list of all the sampling units which are belonging to the population. The third step is to choose the appropriate sampling design. Either the design could be a probability procedure or a non-probability procedure that we would be discussing in the subsequent slides. Then the fourth step comes of determination of the sampling size, that is of prime importance. And the last step is of instruction for selecting actual members of the sample. The first step, when we say, it is the important step to define the population and becomes of primary importance. Now they should be defined in terms of the elements, the units, the extent and the time. The second step is to specify the sampling frame, which we have already discussed. The third step is to choose an appropriate sampling design, and the sampling design, it basically describes the procedure by which the sample is to be selected. The fourth step is that once the procedure is decided, the next step is to determine the quantity and the quantum of the sample to be taken. How large the sample should be taken to view. The last step, that is the fifth step, is basically the interviewer who are to go to the field to actually collect the data. They need very clear and accurate information and instruction about how to do their job. Now the sampling planning is therefore not complete until all the instructions are prepared and handed over to the invigilators. When we talk about sample design, so sample design एक ऐसा procedure होता है through which samples are collected. There are two ways and two methods by which samples could be collected. पहला method है probability sampling method. Second is the non-probability sampling method. Probability sampling method में एक ये ऐसा सिचुएशन है जहां पर हर एलिमेंट पॉपुलेशन का दे हैव देयर ओन एंड नोन चांसेस ऑफ बीइंग सिलेक्टेड. Yes, there are a lot of number of different sampling procedures, those who fall under the probability sampling method. पहला है simple random sampling, then comes systematic sampling, then comes stratified sampling, and lastly is the cluster sampling. When we discuss simple random sampling, यहाँ पर in this very method and in this very sampling design, each member of the population, they have a very known and equal probability of being included in the sample, and it is nowadays not widely used in the marketing research. जहाँ पे हर यूनिट का एक इक्वल और नोन चांस होता है सैंपल में इंक्लूड होने का, दैट इज नोन एज द सिंपल रैंडम सैम्पलिंग. देन कम्स सिस्टमैटिक सैम्पलिंग. Yes, the mechanics are very simple. Here the population, it is consist of ordered n units and a sample size of n, which is selected from the population in such a manner that n over n is equal to k, where k is the sample interval. When we talk about stratified sampling, यहाँ पे पूरी population को they are divided into very collective and exhaustive groups, and these groups are basically created on the basis of variables which are known to be correlated with the variables those are under the study. Now the possible criteria of stratification of population could be on the basis of income of the individual, or the age, or the frequency of the purchase of the product. Even the size of the household and the size of the retail store, they become the criteria for stratification. When we talk about cluster sampling, here all the elements of the population, they are divided into suitable clusters, and only few clusters are randomly selected, and all the elements of these selected cluster, they are then used, and this is referred to as the cluster sampling. Now this method of collecting data is very cheap because the collection of data is basically nearby to the units is easier. It is faster and more convenient than collecting data over units which are scattered over a region. When we discuss about non-probability sampling method, इस मेथड के अंदर हर आइटम के पास एक इक्वल प्रोबेबिलिटी नहीं होती चूज होने की सैंपल के लिए. सो देयर इज नो अटेम्प्ट टू सेलेक्ट अ रिप्रेजेंटेटिव सैंपल. द एलिमेंट्स ऑफ द सैंपल, they are selected on the convenience and or the judgment of the researcher or the field interviewer. Now this selection process is very subjective in nature. When we talk about sample design, there is called as convenience sampling in non-probability. Now here the samples, they are basically picked or selected at the convenience of the researcher. What the researcher feels convenient. Now there is no way in which the representativeness can be established, and therefore it is not possible to make an estimate of the sampling error, because the difference between the sample estimate and the population parameter, they are not known, and they are not known in terms of the magnitude and the direction. Then comes judgment sampling. It is also referred to as purposive sampling. इस सैम्पलिंग प्रोसीजर में रिसर्चर खुद से और पर्पसली he draws a sample from the population which he thinks is a representative of the population. He uses his judgment to make sure that yes, the sample that he is picking is the representative of the population. One comes a quota sampling. When we say quota sampling, it is a very commonly used sampling method किसी भी marketing research में. यहाँ पे जो सैंपल सेलेक्ट किए जाते हैं, they are basically selected on parameters like एज के बेसिस पे, या इनकम के बेसिस पे, या सेक्स के बेसिस पे, या ऑक्यूपेशन के बेसिस पे. द इन्वेस्टिगेटर जो होता है, he is instructed to choose the samples that conform to these parameters. और हर एक फील्ड वर्कर को यहाँ पे एक कोटा असाइन किया जाता है, कोटा ऑफ द नंबर ऑफ यूनिट्स, दोज यूनिट्स विच आर सैटिस्फाइंग द रिक्वायर्ड कैरेक्टरिस्टिक, जिनके बेसिस पे डेटा कलेक्ट करना है. Now when we talk about the estimation of the sample size, there is an approach which is referred to as confidence interval approach. And when we talk about this approach, it is a procedure of constructing confidence intervals for population mean and the population proportion. Here is a formula which is used where z is equal to x bar minus mu over sigma over n. When we use these terms, mu is the population means, x bar is the sample mean, it is the standard deviation of the population, then S is the standard deviation of the sample, P bar is the sample proportion, P refers to the population proportion, and N refers to the number of items in the sample, and that refers to the sample size. Now another is the hypothesis testing approach. Here the estimation of sample size is basically based on the hypothesis testing approach, जहाँ पे type 1 error और type 2 errors का यूज होता है. Type 1 error अकर होता है where we reject H0, that is null hypothesis, when it is true. Type 2 error तब अकर होता है जहाँ पे H when it is false. So we need and we will use A to denote the probability of committing a type 1 error, whereas P is used to denote the probability of making type 2 error. 2 exercises: how can we estimate the sample size and what is the sample design? Thank you and have a nice day. Keep learning and we learning.